Good evening and welcome back to further conversations on the Gospel of Luke. We are beginning into Luke chapter 18 this week. We're going to get part of the way through it, but we'll pick up on the rest of it next week. In Luke 18, Jesus begins with a story about persistence in prayer. It's a very interesting story with some contrasts in it. And Jesus starts telling this to tell us about the importance of praying and not giving up, or at least that's how Luke introduces the story for us. And we see a woman, probably a widow, who keeps going to this unjust judge and looking for justice against her adversary. We're not given any more details than that, but she will not let the issue rest. And the unjust judge gets so tired of having her come by, he finally decides, just to get her out of my hair, I'll give her what she wants. And this particular story hinges on two things. Number one, she keeps showing up. In fact, she will not leave it alone at all. And number two, God really is not like the judge who only answers because the woman is annoying. She doesn't have anything to offer him, and she's probably alone. My guess is she can't afford a lawyer for herself, so he gives her what he wants. But God's not like that. That's the point that Jesus is trying to make. God will give us answers to our prayers quickly. And Jesus goes on to say the elect, the Christians, disciples, people who follow him, are crying out for justice. And he says they'll get that pretty quickly. Go back and read Psalm 123, verses 3 and 4, after you're through with this here, and you'll hear the psalmist cries out to God to have mercy on him and I guess all of them, the elect, the people of God. They've endured a lot of ridicule and contempt from the proud. So the psalmist is kind of expressing the same prayer that the woman does, or that Jesus, I think, wants us to do as well. And reminds us in telling the story that God will answer them soon, quickly, or maybe just suddenly. God will answer if we keep crying out to him. And it really boils down to a matter of faith. Do we have enough faith to persist? And then Jesus goes on to tell a story I think a lot of us are somewhat familiar with, and it's a story of self-righteousness versus recognition of sin. Jesus tells the story about a Pharisee who was one with a certain degree of smug satisfaction and contempt for others. In fact, Luke begins the story for us. He actually tells us Jesus told the parable to address those who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everyone else. And I want to throw in a word of caution here, because this isn't just about the religious or the rich or church leaders who are prone to this kind of self-satisfaction and contempt and looking down their nose at other people. Be careful of putting this attitude only on a certain group, usually the other guys who are not like us. Could very well be any one of us who develop this attitude for ourselves. And yet Jesus tells a story about a guy with an opposite attitude. The publican, a tax collector, he goes and he prays with a great, deep and abiding sense of humility. Aware of his sin, he will not even raise his eyes to heaven when he prays. And Jesus tells us this is the man who goes home justified before God. A man who I think justifiably and correctly understood the human predicament before a holy God. We're all sinners, and all we can do is throw ourselves at his mercy. Jesus then tells a little bit of some interesting things about children and how to such people belong the kingdom of God. And I think he's talking about people who are vulnerable and dependent. They need to depend on something, a strength greater than themselves, perhaps. And then he goes into the story. He encounters a rich ruler. And we've only got the chance here to introduce him. We only started this conversation in our Wednesday night conversation about this. So we'll just kind of mention a couple things that we mentioned on Wednesday night. Number one, he was attached to power and prestige that accompanies money. More than likely, that was part of the reason he had so much trouble giving it up. I suspect, too, it might have made him feel kind of secure rather than vulnerable and dependent like the children Jesus mentioned in the very previous statement. And although this guy had been a very good person all of his life, he just couldn't seem to overcome the obstacle that were his wealth and his possessions, or the obstacles that were his wealth and his possessions. We'll talk a little bit more about him next week, but maybe you can read the story and kind of be prepared to think about your own attachment or non-attachment to your money and finances. Enjoy the conversation this week. Look forward to seeing you next week.